and welcome everybody to the next edition of our webinar series, which is covering the regulation of medical technologies. Today, this particular section, we're going to talk about clinical work and clinical trials, clinical investigations, clinical evaluations. And I'm really delighted to invite Camilla Fleetcroft to our call this afternoon. Camilla originally qualified as a doctor and looked to build her career in public health. She took up a position of clinical advisor at the MHRA, our regulator, back in 2013. Since then, she has spent a short time with a notified body, SGS, as the Regulatory and Clinical Affairs Manager, before returning back to MHRA to head up the Clinical Investigations and Evaluation team. In 2020, she took on the role of Device Regulatory Group Manager, alongside the work to support the response for the pandemic. She also led the team responsible for reviewing and developing the consultation on CA marking. So that's really relevant for our discussions as well today. At the end of May, Camilla said farewell to the MHRA, deciding that the role of the regulator wasn't quite for her, so she's now joined a team at Eclevar MedTech as the Vice President of Regulatory and Clinical Affairs, with a key focus on building their presence and offerings in the UK. So welcome again, Camilla, and it's really good to have you with us. So Camilla, we're going to talk about clinicals and clinical evaluations and clinical investigations. So this is a real key piece to the regulatory puzzle that our SMEs are looking to fill. So let's first of all explore what a clinical program for a product looks like. How does that actually formulate itself?
So there is no one answer to this. It's never a one size fits all in medtech and IVDs. So I think if it's all right with you, I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of how I see it, certainly from my regulatory background and moving forward as part of my role at the CRO. So a clinical or performance program is that plan you put in place really to collect, appraise, analyze that data that is specific to your product. It's about providing the data that supports the use of your product, and it's an ongoing plan. It starts at the beginning with your development, your pre-market data, and carries on through that conformity assessment process and beyond that for the life cycle of the product. It really is that sort of flexible, fluid plan that you put in place. So the data obtained within those activities should establish the sufficient clinical data to demonstrate compliance with the relevant safety and performance requirements you've identified, particularly, and this is important, when it's used as you intend. That is the purpose of this. It's about as you're meant to use it, for the purpose you're meant to use it, generating that data to support that. It should also clearly set out the benefits and risks, and these should be specified not just high level, but in terms of their nature, the likelihood of them happening, the extent of these risks and the duration, and indeed also frequency of how often these risks are likely to occur. And what you really have to do there is look to set out that the benefit risk ratio you're setting out is appropriate and is, suitable to be put on the market. Just to mention IVD specifically here, for IVDs, they use the term performance evaluation, not clinical evaluation. And this is really an assessment analysis of the data to establish or verify the validity, both all scientific, analytical, and indeed clinical performance where appropriate for that IVD. But hopefully we'll pick that up in a little bit more detail during the discussion. So just on this point, just to add to what I've already said, I think it's really important to note that clinical evaluation, performance evaluation, whatever we want to call it, it has some really key steps, and these have been developed and put in place over the last few years, certainly with MedDev 271 revision 4, and moving on into the new EU regs. It is a concept that is very much ingrained in the sector now, so I just wanted to take the opportunity to set that out. So your first point of call is your scope and your planning. And this really is looking at the profile of the products you've got under review and looking at the requirements that you need to demonstrate have been met. Then you move on to the identification of your relevant pertinent data. And this can be data either held by the manufacturer themselves or retrieved through a scientific literature review. So appraisal of data is next, and you're really looking at determining the value, the weight of that data that you're putting into this evaluation and how it really relates to those requirements that you're looking to demonstrate. It must be systematic and unbiased. You must demonstrate your clear methodology and your justification for what you've put in that plan and what you're intending to carry out. So just a little bit about the criteria. It is always been suggested and it's adopted that the criteria you put in place should reflect the nature and the history and the intended use of that product that you've got, and justified against the generally acknowledged state of the art in that sector. Again, there are no strict requirements on the ways this is done. There are many acceptable ways. We don't like one size fits all in medtech, so it could be quantitative or qualitative methodology, and that's a judgment that has to be made by the manufacturer, knowing their product, knowing what they're trying to demonstrate, and again, very clearly justified in this evaluation process. So once you've got your data, next thing you have to do is analyze it, and again, sound methods. Justify your methods. It should be scientific. It shouldn't be high-level narrative. This really is about getting to the nitty-gritty of that data and why it is appropriate for your device, why it demonstrates the safety and performance of your device. And indeed, this is a really key stage for you identifying any gaps in that clinical data that you may have and allowing the manufacturer that time to think about what might be needed to fill those gaps if necessary. This, of course, may be to conduct an additional clinical investigation or a performance study for your IVDs. Also, just to add, this stage should also pick up on the post-market needs for this product, any residual risks, any uncertainties that you may have in that development stage. They should be identified, analysed, and indeed plans put in place where appropriate for moving beyond that conformity assessment stage. There is also the logistics of writing the report, which you'll give to you'll keep in the folder or give to your notified or approved body. And again, this should demonstrate all the analysis you've done, but also moving forward that post-market activities. And like I said, this is very fluid, it's iterative, you build on it. So this isn't an end of the story. Once you put those post-market activities into place and you start to generate that real-world data for your product, it feeds in, it adds in, and you continually do that analysis to make sure that primarily that benefit-risk ratio is still acceptable, and that if you have identified further risks or uncertainties, they're documented, they're assessed, and you can move forward with hopefully building a really solid, highly scrutinized clinical evaluation that supports your device staying on the market.
Camilla, do you know, one of the things which we've found as we're going through these webinars is a consistency of terms. You know, like we're talking about the importance of the intended purpose and driving that through the way that you do things and that sort of stuff. And hopefully people will pick up on some of those sorts of things. Just a couple of questions which come from that first bit, those first bits though. One of the things which I was always taught, and I'm not sure whether this is true or not, maybe you can dispel the myth. I was always taught that when we're talking about medtech, we're talking about clinical performance as opposed to clinical efficacy, which you see potentially in pharmaceuticals. What's the difference there?
Oh, the $1 million question, Phil. This has come up many times in my career as well. And I think you could ask 5 different people and get 5 different answers on what they think the difference is. So a colleague of mine have had many debates, and we sort of came to the agreement between ourselves, and I'm caveating this is our position and not in any way a legal standing, is that performance is, does that cardiac stent open that artery? Does it do it? Yes, it does. The clinical efficacy is, has that improved the patient's condition? So there's that slight nuance of the efficacy being about, have you actually improved the situation, or has it just done what it said on the tin? Has it has it opened up the artery? And that's the slight nuance. I don't know if that's a clinician's based nuance. Certainly the colleague was a doctor as well. But it is a really difficult sort of shift in that terminology. And it's certainly something that's come up before around, should we move to the idea of efficacy rather than performance? And I think that's a debate that will burn for a long time yet. But a really interesting question, Phil. I hope my idea makes some sense to the audience.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I remember sort of trying to argue for performance when it comes to things like hip implants, which might have, you're trying to demonstrate efficacy of that implant over maybe a 10-year time frame for implantation, as opposed to whether or not it's performing as a hip implant in the first couple of years, and I think that there is a real interesting debate to be had there for sure. And one of the things as well that you mentioned right at the end of that piece was around the report that you're writing and the output of your clinical investigation or your evaluation. One thing which people often ask is, well, do I need a medic to actually write that for me, or can I write that myself as a regulatory person? If we're working with these webinars are primarily for small companies, and they may not necessarily have that medical input. How can they sort of meet that challenge?
Well, first I'll just know it doesn't have to be a medic. It has to be someone who's got the skills to do it, and that could be a medic. Indeed, some medics might not have the skills to do it. It could be a scientific expert, a regulatory expert who knows what you're expected to put in there. But I think what's really important from my perspective and what I've seen over the years is that it might not be that one person can do it all. And actually it's about pulling together the expertise you need to make sure that the analysis is correct, the methodology is sound, and that, yes, there may be a medical writer along the line who's pulling it all together. So that's why it's really important. These webinars are a really great idea to build that basic understanding, but actually also to know when you need to reach out to someone who knows and can do it for you, probably quicker and more efficiently, without struggling through the requirements. So, look to your CROs, look to your consultants, look to the regulator if you really need to, but beware, obviously they can't consult, so they won't write it for you, but they might flag some red flags for you. But no, it does. To answer your question, it doesn't have to be a doctor, just has to be someone who's got the right qualification to do so. The majority of the ones I've seen have been written by science graduates who know the product inside out and they know the regulations on top of it.
Great. And that's probably the most important thing, isn't it? People who understand exactly what the product's doing, and that goes then back to the intended purpose and how you're going to use it.
Yeah.
One of the other webinars that we've run already is on classification and how we determine classification. Is the clinical program sort of married to classification? Is it determined by classification, or is that not so critical?
Well, I think it'd be fair to say that your product journey is completely guided by the classification of the product you've got. So yes, in turn, this clinical evaluation is equally shaped by it to a degree. So the key steps I set out before, they should be followed in all cases. It is an obligation to generate that data to make this conclusion for your own product around the evidence that you've got. But the depth and breadth and shape of that plan and evaluation will be different for each device. Like I said, one size does not fit all. So sort of, for example, if you're thinking about your lower risk devices, it may be quite justifiable that you don't do a clinical investigation. You might have plenty of data in the literature that already exists. But however, and certainly in light of the new MDR in the EU, moving to those higher risk devices, those novel products where there is limited data, the emphasis really does become much more on that direct clinical research and that sort of increased scrutiny of the data. So I think, to answer your question, yes, classification actually does judge it. There are new rules. There's quite a clear journey for those higher risk products to be followed. But the principle has to be done for all products. So when you self-certify, you do tick a box to say, I've got the data to support my product. this should be part of it in whatever shape that might be.
And actually, you just answered my next question. You know, is
Sorry.
that well, it's all around risk, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, and I mean that's one of those things which constantly comes up. Is, well, you know, I've only got a class 1 product. I've only got a tongue depressor, or I've only got a, I had a call the other day from a company that manufactured stretchers for mountain rescue. You know, and they said, well, we don't have to worry about the clinical side of these, do we? But of course, you've got to remember that you're dealing with those clinical sections of the requirements, right?
Yeah, I mean, take that stretcher. It's got to carry a person and it's got to not injure them. So there does have to be an evaluation of that product. And like I said, the shape and size of that will vary. But there is that due diligence on the manufacturer that says, we know that this product is safe. It does what we want it to do. And that is in the context of public and patient health and safety. You know, this is what we're here to do. We're to put devices on the market to support them, to support their health journey. There needs to be that due diligence, proportionate, of course, to what your device is, that says, yes, this is fine to be on the market.
Great. Okay, so another $64,000 question.
Oh, God.
And it's probably one of those things, because we've moved from directive to regulations now in Europe particularly. But what about equivalence? I mean, at one time we used to be able to say, oh, my product is just the same as somebody else's that they made sort of 6 months ago, or it, you know, it does the same job, so therefore I don't have to do my clinical work. How does equivalence work now?
Asking all the fun questions, Phil. So equivalence.
Well, it is a Friday.
So the landscape around equivalence has shifted over the last few years, and one particular time point for that was 2016 when they released revision 4 of MedDev 271, and this really it made that shift from, oh, it's my device is like that, I can use that data, to really emphasising the need to justify the use of this data. Now, I mean, equivalence could probably have its own webinar, Phil, but maybe that's for another discussion. It is important that equivalence is not used, and it's certainly not seen as a shortcut to doing that clinical evaluation. So obviously the concept of equivalence is that you're taking one other product and using the data that's already accessible on that product to support your own product. Now, this can be really valuable if it's used correctly and appropriately. So there are some considerations that I'm sure the audience know, but I will run through them when using equivalence in that evaluation of your product. So the starting point, of course, is the 3 criteria: clinical, technical, biological characteristics. They all have to be considered if you're going to go down this path. There are a few considerations here. I won't list all of them, but just a few headlines. So for clinical characteristics, you're really looking at a device that is used in the same clinical condition, the same intended purpose. It's used at the same point of the body, and indeed used in a similar population. That could be gender, age, ethnicity, all manner of things. And that the device that you're comparing to is not predicted to show any significant differences in how it performs. So you really are looking for a like for like in terms of clinical characteristics. Technical characteristics are a bit different in that they introduce the word similar. So you can have a device of similar design used under the same conditions, however, but similar specifications or properties. And they should also have very similar deployment methods for the user. Now, just a note around the term similar here, and it pops up a few times, is that it is actually quite important. Where we use the word similar, those variations must be reviewed and analysed and make sure that there is minimal clinical impact of those differences occurring when you're talking about the performance and safety of the product. So it's almost like a little gap analysis that you have to do. Say, I note there's some differences in the design. What is their impact? And if there's nothing demonstrably different and clinically different, then it's okay. But you do need to be very mindful that those small differences can make a difference. So you need to make sure that you're justifying that. The final characteristic is biological. And now this is where they should be using the same materials and substances, certainly the ones that come into contact with the human tissues or body fluids. and that's really it for biological. It's the smaller of the characteristics, but equally very important one. So if you've gone through this and you have decided that your product is equivalent and it's, you know, a valuable addition to your clinical evaluation, then there must be a critical appraisal of the data, as you would for your own product, of this other product's data. If done well, I have to say, and appropriately, equivalent data can be a hugely beneficial, scientifically valid addition to your evaluation. But obviously, we know, we've learned from the past, sometimes it's misused, and that's certainly the direction of travel. Certainly we've seen in the MDR, is that it's a valid route, but it has to be used appropriately and done well.
So thank you.
Not an easy route, but certainly valuable.
It's really not. And I know that you know, in many of our trade association meetings, that whole question of equivalence is really tricky for people to get used to. And I guess at the end of the day, when you were talking about having a really good critique at the end of all of that to make sure that you have that evaluation as independently as you can, I guess in many ways that's where you might want to try to use medical expertise. Okay, so let's change tack a little bit. What about performance of IVDs? Because that's become more in the spotlight recently with the pandemic, but also as we're changing regulations in Europe, and presumably here that's what's likely to happen with the CA marking of diagnostics here. So what about performance of diagnostics? How does that work?
Well, firstly, I think you're absolutely right. They've definitely come under fire. And so I think for the purpose of this, I'm going to look more towards the changes we've already seen in the EU, because I do think they answer a lot of the challenges, although they create a lot of challenges as well, of what we've seen of sort of legacy IVDs. So performance evaluation for an IVD is in principle very similar. It's based on that assessment analysis of pertinent data for your particular product. And the sort of definition is establishing and verifying scientific validity, analytical performance, and indeed where you need it, clinical performance of that IVD. So the performance evaluation, similar to the concept we've seen for other medical devices, that all indications and claimed benefits need to be addressed, and they need to have that appropriate supporting evidence within the evaluation. So again, this is an iterative process. It's ongoing. It continues through the life cycle of that IVD. And the key steps I mentioned earlier very much apply. You have your planning and scope stage. You've got your data identification. So that's looking at how do you establish that scientific, analytical, and clinical validity. And these three pillars are really the principal foundation for this process. And so I just think it'd be worth, if that's okay, just to touch on them in a little bit more detail. So your scientific validity is about the extent to which that analyte or the marker can be picked up by that IVD, and is associated with that sort of targeted physiological state or clinical condition. So how good is it and how much does it pick that up, really? Analytical performance is the demonstration of the IVD's ability to correctly detect or measure that particular analyte. And clinical performance, where appropriate, is the demonstration of that IVD's ability to yield the results that are correlated with that clinical condition that they're being used for, or a physiological state, or indeed a pathological state. And it's, again, in accordance with that targeted population, the intended user. Once you put it into that hospital, is it giving patients and doctors the result it should do, ultimately? Now, we do know that not all IVDs will be in that setting. So that, again, is down to the manufacturer to make that decision on whether they need to add that clinical validity in. But I'll probably touch on that in a minute when I get going. So the next step, once you've got these three pillars in place, is to appraise that data you've identified. So very similar, analyze it, evaluate it, come up with your conclusions. And again, that's not the end of the story. There's that ongoing monitoring through your post-market activities. So as with any healthcare product, this is a benefit risk ratio. And again, the risks must be considered, and sort of the benefit risk should be discussed in light of that state of the art on the market for that process at that time. So it is also important to consider existing data and how to bridge any deficits. Obviously, with the huge transition to the IVDR, we're seeing a lot of questions around legacy data. How do I fill the gaps? So it may be that where new data is required, then a performance study is going to need to be set up and conducted. With the expected up classification, certainly in the EU, we are seeing increased notified body involvement and therefore increased scrutiny of potentially that clinical data. So if clinical performance data is needed, it needs to be done with the new requirements. How are you going to meet this up classification requirements? What are your new safety and performance requirements? They need to be identified. The data needs to support them. And you need to be able to evaluate that and provide a very scientifically robust conclusion that says this IVD does what it's meant to, it's clinically safe, and we can go onto the market. So I think the trouble a lot of IVD manufacturers, and certainly the feedback we've had, is filling those gaps. What do they need to do to fill those gaps? And for some, that is quite a big gap to fill, and certainly very appreciative of the struggles that industry have voiced on this.
Do you know, I'm so glad that you're on the call here. I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask you another personal question here. You must have had fun, actually. Well, if fun is the right word, during the pandemic, and looking at the performance of those lateral flow tests. As a user of those lateral flow tests, I was getting negative results, and I was thinking to myself, am I using this right? Am I using the swabs correctly? Am I putting it up my nose long enough? All of those sorts of things. How many patients did those companies have to look at before they could say that that lateral flow test was effective in picking up things like COVID? That must have been a nightmare.
What a challenge the pandemic posed for all sides of the sector. I obviously can't share clinical data, Phil. I can't. But I think those were a fine example of this iterative, ongoing process where we were dealt a very unique and challenging. Is that underestimating the impact of the pandemic? It was a challenging time. But industry felt that too, and industry had to come up with these tests at pace. And I think, what we've seen is that engagement of that iterative process of constantly providing data. I think the discussions that we've had, both when I was at MHRA, but following, is that it was such an incredible learning curve. But I think it really demonstrated the benefit of these types of performance evaluation, the benefit of saying, well, this is how we know it works at the point of market access, but actually, we've discovered this, and this is how it's changing. And certainly we've seen some change in instructions for use for some of the tests as they learn, as they establish whether, like yourself, people are putting them up their nose far enough, or whether actually just throat swabs are better or just nasal swabs are better. It's about learning, and it's about making sure that it's not I'm on the market, great, job done, I'll just sit here and take in my payments. It's actually about that responsibility as the manufacturer that says, great, I'm on the market, fantastic, let's get that real world data, let's learn about this device in the real world setting, and let's make changes where it's appropriate. The medtech sector is so fast paced, we know it, we see iterations almost daily. So it's about that learning curve. And that's why this sort of session is really interesting, because it doesn't matter what your product is, you're going to learn about it. The healthcare professionals are also going to learn about it. And together with that data, I think we're starting to see the power of harnessing it and using it to further develop the devices. So I think it's only a good thing that the pandemic showed us. We might not have thought so at the time, but
I was almost, even though I was feeling really rough at the time, I was almost glad when I got that line on my test strip, because I thought, at least I'm using them properly, and I know that I wasn't giving false positives sort of earlier on in the process. But okay, so What about combination and companion products? They must have their own unique challenges because you're pitching different technologies against each other. Does the clinical package or the clinical evaluations vary depending on what you have?
Yeah, I mean, different technologies, but also often different manufacturers. So you've got logistical issues as well with your companion diagnostics. So this is a really fascinating area. And this is an area where that regulatory jurisdiction you're marketing in is actually quite relevant. So just to sort of a quick context is obviously in the UK, we're still based on the IVDD, where a lot of companion diagnostics are self-certifying. For the EU, we know that they've introduced that definition for that companion diagnostic and that it's moderate to high risk. So there is a clear shift in those requirements. So it's something to be mindful of. I think for the purpose of this moving forward, I'm going to touch a little bit more on what the impact of those EU regs really does mean for companion diagnostics, because I think they're really critical. And from my perspective, a very welcome shift in what can actually be, like I said, a very moderate to high risk product and very important in treating some very serious conditions. So like I said, under the directive, a lot of them self-certified, but now transitioning to having to go through approved or notified body assessment. And what you're really looking for under these new requirements is that proof of clinical conformity of that IVD, which will be assessed by the notified bodies. But equally, on top of that, there is the requirement that the national medicines agencies, the EMA, also contribute to that assessment of the companion diagnostic. So they will be consulted by the notified bodies with regard to that performance and safety of the companion diagnostic that you're putting forward. This also comes back to that point I made around gaps in your data. A lot of these products are a very key area that will have those gaps. So it is likely that competent authorities will see an increase in clinical performance studies coming through for the companion diagnostics. And the reason that the competent authorities will be impacted is that these are considered interventional clinical performance studies for the most part. They will require your competent authority approval as well as your ethical approval. So another little hurdle, unfortunately, for companion products. But I think it's really, from my personal perspective, I think it's a welcome shift. Like I said, I think that data is really quite critical, and it's just about the implementation. I will flag that I think that we need to help industry with. So if you've got your companion diagnostic and you do have that data gap, like I said, you're going to have to do that study, and so that requires the full caboodle. So you've got to have your protocol, your investigator's brochure, informed consent of your population that you're using. And also the other documents that you'll see in ISO. Oh, I can't remember my numbers now. Sorry, 2916. So that really is a really important standard that is quite new, published in 2019, that sets out the requirements of IVD studies. But I think what's really important and really interesting in the companion diagnostic space is that they are being treated very much as their own entity. They're a very special group that, like you said, cross those boundaries. So, you know, the question around combined products and whether it be a medical device and a medicine or an IVD and a medicine is another interesting one to have. And it's about how those two regulations cross. And I think the companion diagnostics, are really interesting, where actually there's been that real sort of direction that says the European Medicines Agency or your national medicines agency has to have a say, and that it does have to be that joint look at whether that companion diagnostic is going to do what it needs to do to be of value to that medicine and therefore those patients.
So we know that we have to have a clinical program irrespective of classification, irrespective of whether they're combinations or companions or whatever. But how do I go about developing that clinical protocol? Where's the first place I should look?
So if you're moving into the world of having to do research, fill in those gaps, then the clinical protocol, a really good first port of call is your standards, your ISO standards. So for medical devices, you've got ISO 14155, which is around your good clinical practice when conducting research in human subjects, which was updated in 2020. Also to note, it is now a harmonised standard for the MDR, so therefore it has to be considered. But I will flag it is a really useful standard. It's one of the ones I'm more fond of. It's certainly the standard the MHRA has held clinical investigations against for many years, as have the EU. And it is a really helpful document. It steers around the rights and the safety of your patients and how to really truly conduct those research projects. For IVDs, until recently, the 14155 was very much used to sort of transpose the principles to IVDs. But obviously with the publication of 2916, that has changed slightly. And we now have a standard that is dedicated to those clinical performance studies using specimens from human subjects. So that is a very welcome shift. Again, it looks at those rights, the safety, dignity, well-being of the study participants, and make sure that the data generated, both of these standards do this, make sure that the data generated is scientifically valid and that it's reliable and robust, and that you are doing due diligence for the research. Because to be honest, if your research is questionable and challengeable, then the data is going to be equally challengeable, and you'll find an approved body or a notified body will probably have lots of red pen to put all over your clinical evaluation. So it is worth looking at those standards. It's worth taking on board their principles. But in sort of general terms, to answer your question around a protocol, what you're really looking to set out is your rationale for why you're doing it. What are your objectives and the defined endpoints? Do you have a clear justification for your study design? Like I've said, it's not one size fits all. Some devices may be fine with an observational study, others may need a full randomized control trial. There is no set rule book. Methodology to be used, you must have your clear statistical considerations set out. Again, monitoring activities, how are you picking up the data, how are you protecting your participants? Record keeping and data handling, obviously very important, particularly considerations around GDPR. And then sort of finally, the final point is that method of analysis, and how are you going to make this scientifically valid and robust? And where necessary, we touched on it briefly around consent, make sure you've got the appropriate consent, right. Patient information, where appropriate. Obviously, if you don't have active participants, that's not necessary, but you do need to bear in mind consent around data use as well, not necessarily just directly to patients, but that's certainly something that you can work through with a CRO or consultant if you need to, but also the regulator, as they go through the assessment, the competent authorities will pick up on these things, as will the ethical committees as you submit any application to them.
Yeah, I think that's the next step, isn't it? Once I've got a protocol, I can't just go out and run them in a hospital or anything. I have to go through to your old colleagues at MHRA, right? Next step, yeah. So you've got your wonderfully designed protocol and research project in place. You're absolutely right, Phil. Next step is your competent authority. And for the most part, this is quite limited interaction. It is an application assessment process. So if you have done a good job and you've got a really nice, robust process and plan set out, then hopefully it should be fairly painless. But they do need to review non-CE marked or UKCA marked product trials and performance studies, obviously moving forward under the IVDR. It's an interesting process. Certainly at MHRA, we try to take a very engaged, pragmatic approach to these assessments, being supportive where we can. But what will happen is that you submit and you'll have rounds of questions where the assessors will ask you for either further detail or clarification. And then hopefully at the end of that time period, you get a big fat yes, and you can go ahead. Just to bear in mind that it's not just that competent authority approval you need for a lot of these research projects, you need your ethical as well. And certainly those familiar with the MHRA will know that there is work going on around having that joint
answer. So sort of a one answer for that competent authority for both ethical and regulatory approval. Sort of other interaction I think to bear in mind with competent authorities is it's not just that pre-market study, it's also that post-market space. I'm aware you're going to have a webinar on sort of post-market activities, but that's where the bulk of that interaction will happen. So what you don't want is your clinical evaluation to be questionable and a competent authority to come knocking on your door. So if your device is self-certified, where you haven't had that input from a notified body, or indeed the competent authority may not even have had to do a clinical investigation, whilst the registration is quite simple, you log onto the MHRA website, you give them £100 and off you go, they do have the right to look at the data if there are concerns. So it's not about flying under the radar, still do due diligence regardless of your product to make sure that actually if a review was to happen, if something was to go wrong, you've still got that data, you've got the backup. Things do go wrong. We know they go wrong. And sometimes that is fault of no one other than just learning, like I said, about the product in the real world. So that's where the bulk of your competent authority engagement will happen, is afterwards.
Well, yeah, and as you say, we'll sort of talk separately about post-market surveillance, because that has its own sort of important requirements, which we probably need to talk about. But just as a last question, then, I mean, we left Europe all those months ago, and of course, one of the things which people often say, not necessarily as a result of Brexit, but increasingly now, as we become a sovereign nation, is can we in fact make this clinical investigation work or clinical evaluation work more international? Can you run these as international studies? What sort of things would you have to consider if you're thinking outside of the UK as well?
I think it's a really interesting and important point, actually, Phil. As the medtech sector evolves and continues to evolve, that global question is more and more at the front of everyone's mind, is can we be a bit more joined up? There is nothing to stop an international programme, for want of a better phrase. We often at the MHRA saw clinical trials with multiple sites in America, the EU, further afield in Asia. And they are given the same consideration. Now, there are a few nuances, obviously within the different jurisdictions, the FDA, the EU, the UK now, we're all slightly different and all probably have our own foibles that you need to be mindful of. So I think just a bit of personal experience in reviewing trial applications is that your documentation should never just be a copy and paste. If you copy and paste your protocols, your requirements, your consent documents from the FDA, for example, they won't meet all the requirements of the EU, or they'll be at odds with some of the requirements of the EU. So it's just to be mindful that if you are going to go down sort of a one dossier fits all, you do need to pull out those differences and you need to highlight them and make sure that you're covering all eventualities. Now, obviously, it sounds a bit more burdensome, but actually it doesn't. In practice, it's not too bad once you get to the basics of it. You know, the reality is we want clinical performance and safety data to say that the device can go on the market. The regulatory nuances are there, but they're not insurmountable if you want to go down this sort of approach. And I think it's a good point, a good point to raise the IMDRF, and certainly working to that global harmonization. And certainly they have produced guidance around clinical data and clinical investigations on that global platform and what can be done. The difficulty that I most often saw, and I certainly saw it sometimes when I was briefly at the notified body, is the relevance of populations and healthcare systems. So this is where actually it's really important to just pause and say, okay, I've used this data in Asia, but the healthcare system is actually fundamentally very different. The ways of practice are very different. Therefore, is that clinical investigation valid in the EU or America, wherever it might be? and actually just to pause and really justify that data, or actually even if you can't justify it, say this is the data we've got in this setting, we need to fill that gap, we need to support it with further data. So it comes down to that, using data appropriately. So like I said, nothing to stop you doing an international program. There just are a few considerations if you're going to be using international data.
Right.
Yeah, and just don't annoy the regulators by having, FDA splashed all over an EU submission.
Understood. And just so that people are really clear, if you're doing those international studies, let's say I'm doing a study where my principal investigator is in Spain. If I get an approval from the Spanish authority, that doesn't mean I can then go to a hospital in Manchester, does it?
No.
I still have to go to the MHRA in the UK.
Absolutely. A point I should have made, Phil. Thank you. Yes, you need approval from every country that you have a site in. So we are not at the point where any other country will recognise the UK's approval or the FDA's approval. It is about, has the country itself approved, particularly their ethics committee will want approval, because it comes back to the point of every healthcare system is slightly different, and every requirement around ethics, consent, data protection, all have their own nuances. So there does need to be a country focused aspect to the applications. Yeah.
Brilliant. Camilla, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. We are recording this in the afternoon, so I can get away with that. But thank you so much for coming along and sharing your experiences. I'm sure that the people who are listening to this presentation are going to walk away with some fantastic ideas as to how to approach their clinical work in future. But thank you again, and hopefully we'll look forward to speaking to you when we come to post-market surveillance. But thank you, Camilla.
Thanks, Phil.